John 6:51 through 58. Listen for the word of the living God as we read these words. I am the living bread that came down from heaven. Whoever eats of this bread will live into the age, and the bread that I will give for the living of the world is my flesh. Some Jews then disputed among themselves, saying, how can this man give us his flesh to eat? So Jesus said to them, verily, truly, I tell you, unless you eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, you have no life in you. Those who eat my flesh and drink my blood have life of the age, and I will raise them up on the last day. For my flesh is true food, and my blood is true drink. Those who eat my flesh and drink my blood abide in me, and I in them. Just as the living Father sent me, and I live because of the Father, so whoever eats me will live because of me. This is the bread that came down from heaven, not like that which your ancestors ate, and they died. But the one who eats this bread will live into the age. The living God still speaks today. Thanks be to God. In last Sunday's gospel text, John appeared to be teaching some form of cannibalism in regard to his own body, though that could have made no sense to his audience. Jesus, being accused of breaking the Sabbath, would have been seen as small beans in comparison to promoting cannibalism. He began tying the idea of living bread both to his body as well as to the manna eaten and the wanderings between Egypt and the Promised Land. How do we make sense out of his words that seem to push the idea of cannibalizing his body for access to the life of the age? Major principle of good biblical interpretation is that if our interpretation could not be understood by the original audience of the speakers, we are most likely far off track. Oh, sure, we can apply the meaning of a text to circumstances and issues that are vastly different from those that they lived and understood. But if our understanding of the text does not fit their context, it's invalid. The context may be that of the character, the writer, the audience to which it was addressed, or some combination thereof. Jesus might apply Jonah's story to a context Jonah could never have considered. But Jesus' words would need to make some sort of sense to Jesus, to the gospel writer, to Jesus' contemporaries, or the people the gospel writer was addressing. If Jesus' words in last Sunday's text were baffling, today's passage clarifies nothing. At first glance, it would seem Jesus is continuing to speak about cannibalizing his body and feeding on his blood like some sort of ritual vampirism. Those concepts would have been absurd to all of his contemporaries. His disciples, as well as the contemporaries of the gospel writers. Jews went to great lengths to drain the blood from an animal that they were going to eat before cooking the meat. Jews took pains to be sure that their food was kosher. In the Muslim tradition, halal is virtually the same as kosher, following many of the very same strictures of how food must be processed and prepared. An animal killed for food could neither be strangled nor unbled. Both were protections against fertility cults, against those traditions claiming to retain the animal's life within its body, so that not only the body but also its spark of life might be consumed, to make one more alive, more powerful. As a whole, the food laws of Torah were directed at creating a gulf between worship of Yahweh and the fertility cult worship all around. Focus of the fertility cult centered on gaining control of the life force around them, claiming it for oneself. The concept was similar to reasons certain native peoples in the Americas took scalps, because they understood that the life force of their opposing warrior resided in the scalp. Headhunters in northern Amazon had similar concepts regarding the shrinking of heads, taking something of that enemy and binding its spirit for their protection or for their power. They used such tokens to take the life force of an enemy under their control. The fertility cults attempted similar aims through the use of things associated with life, procreation, and death. The fertility cults attempted to bring these things into their worship so that they could gain control that was felt to be beyond them. The ritual purity laws of the Jews removed all this from the worship of Yahweh. The fertility cults were focused on controlling their gods. The worship of Yahweh was supposed to eliminate any attempt to control or tame Yahweh as some powerful pet brought along to do one's bidding. Yahweh was not to be considered a jinn enslaved to a lamp or held captive to a bottle or some other device or ritual. Life itself belonged to Yahweh. It was Yahweh's. It was Yahweh's alone. It was not within the range of human authority and action to use the life that Yahweh had given as anything more than a gift. It was a gift in the measure that it was given. I couldn't take the gift that Yahweh had given someone else. Life was to be held sacred. It belonged to Yahweh and Yahweh alone. It's into this background that Jesus speaks about his body and blood being real food, granting life that extends into the coming age. It has no relationship whatsoever to controlling Yahweh or any other spiritual entity. Jesus declares that what he is offering originates in God. It comes from God's initiative. This is nothing that humanity is taking up to control what belongs to God. It's nothing that we're doing to control anything in the spiritual realm. It's rather something of the spiritual realm that has come into our earthly reality for our benefit, wrought by God. It's not within our control. It's nothing we can manipulate. It's rather something that we receive as God's gift. Grace. This is not food for the body. It's not for the mouth or the stomach. It's God's provision for enduring life through God incarnate in Jesus. It's real food in that it is life-giving nourishment. It's not food in the sense of proteins, fats, carbohydrates, vitamins, and minerals. As Jesus had been doing throughout John's Gospel, he continues to use figures of speech to communicate something beyond the limits of human categories, concepts of earthly physical realities. We don't need to become cannibals. We need rather to seek nourishment and new life in Jesus, the life that Jesus lived, taught, modeled on earth in our midst. I was asked this week about salvation by a community member seeking to pigeonhole me or cast me as a heretic. His question centered on one particular aspect of what the Bible recognizes as salvation, zeroing in specifically on getting out of hell and getting into heaven. He set parameters for an answer, stating that salvation was simple and direct, with uncomplicated means and direct answers. He failed to make any recognition that doctrines of salvation are their own field of study in Christian theology, discussed in whole books as well as multiple chapters in systematic theology texts. Salvation is a whole lot more than getting a ticket to heaven or getting a get out of hell free card. It involves the complexity of living. It involves the whole of becoming who God created us to be. It's not a difficult concept per se, but it is broad when we look at it in all of its details. The better translation for the term is perhaps wholeness. As John Wesley spoke of it, he described it as scriptural holiness. It's about our lives being completely transformed, every aspect of our being. For Wesley, this meant visiting prisoners, healing the sick, teaching the children of the poor, pushing for prison reform, making love for neighbor transform not simply one's inner life, but one's outward actions, attitudes, and responses to the outer world. It meant pushing for an end to slavery and all other forms of oppression, from sweatshops to treating women with dignity, honor, respect, and equality. Jesus was not concerned with saving souls in terms of getting people into heaven after their deaths. Jesus' concern with souls came from a recognition that the soul is everything and all that one is. It includes one's economic life, one's political voice, one's housing situation, health care, access to assistance, welcome, food, shelter, clothing. To being treated humanely as one of God's beloved children. It included living into one's identity as God's beloved. No one needs to eat Jesus' physical body to experience any of this. Instead, one needs to consume Jesus' life, Jesus' identity, bringing it into our own lives. We need to shift from existing in this world of flesh, bread, water, and wine to living after the character of life Jesus modeled for us. A life coming from God, a life that would lift us far beyond existence into a wholly new age of living that bridges the limits of physical and temporal reality into an enduring reality past the limitations of death. There's nothing we can wrest from God. It's a life and direction we receive from God instead. Jesus says nothing here about condemnation, escape from hell, or even repentance. He speaks instead of taking into ourselves this new quality and character of life that we find in Jesus' very breathing. His words, his actions. If we would be reconciled to God, it is to do the things of God. It is to live even as Jesus has shown us how to live. Are we ready to fully embrace the life that Jesus presented? I don't need his muscle tissue. I don't need to drain his blood. I need rather to accept a new order of living that he taught and modeled.